Sorry, I think we were both waiting for the other person to speak. I'm most excited now. We're beginning primaries that aren't run pretty much just by white people. I think we're now entering a world where we have some elections that are a little bit more demographically representative of the broader Democratic Party, and we had a taste of that with Nevada. However, there's sort of an asterisk because it's a caucus, and caucuses are already unrepresentative of the electorate because we know those people tend to be a little bit more politically active, politically interested than, say, the average, even Democratic, than the average member of the Democratic electorate. And so we're going to be able to see, I think, something. We're going to be able to make a comparison across some of these early primary states like New Hampshire to compare it with the South Carolina electorate. That is just a little bit distinct. I am curious, and I want to hear everybody's thoughts. I think about how we're going to necessarily treat the results coming out of South Carolina, because there's just such a small runway going into Super Tuesday, and even many of the voters in those Super Tuesday states have already cast their ballots through earlier absentee votes, and so maybe South Carolina isn't going to have the effect that some people may be expecting on some of the Super Tuesday outcomes. But overall, I'm just excited to see what a different electorate is going to inject into this very long primary process.
Yeah, and I think more explicitly, I think it's the potential beginning of Biden's comeback, right? 2 weeks ago, he was sort of dead in the water, at least based off of conventional wisdom. Um, and he said he was going to come in second in Nevada, he was going to come in first in South Carolina, and that would propel him to inevitable victory. I'm not sure about the ending there, but at the very minimum, he did come in second in Nevada, which seemed at least a little implausible coming out of New Hampshire. And while he was essentially virtually tied with Bernie at one point in the South Carolina polls, he has drastically pulled away again to the point where the polls look a little bit closer to what they looked like, for much of 2019 there. So I think that's the biggest storyline in South Carolina is, at this point, you would assume that Biden's going to win it. The question is by how much.
And that's kind of my question, because one thing we talked about before this even started on a much earlier episode, we talked about the importance of momentum versus sequencing and how that was going to work out. And it's all sort of jumbled together, especially as Podcool points out with Super Tuesday coming right on the heels. It's 72 hours later and early voting, and Biden's just starting to do some buys in these states, and Bloomberg's been on the air for months, just blowing it out. But what do you guys think if it is going to be this Biden win? What's and you do believe in the momentum theory of it, and it does have some effect going into South Carolina. What's a good win? Is it sort of any win a good win? I've been calling it sort of a solid win, and I've defined that as probably not as big as we thought a few months ago, but probably larger than we thought possible a few days or weeks ago. So somewhere in that range. But when you're Biden, maybe it's just, hey, I got one more vote. I won. I'm out of here.
I think a decent night for him is something along the lines of a high single digits victory. I think a great night for him is closer to that 15 to 20% mark that he seems to be hitting in a lot of polls over the last few days. And then I think a great night for him involves not so much how much he wins by, but the delegate tracking. So if he's quite behind Bernie at this point. He's in third behind Buttigieg and Bernie on the national delegate tracker. If he's able to pull out, 2/3 or more, there's even an outside chance that he could conceivably take, 90+% of the delegates in South Carolina if everything sort of falls in place. Bernie's under 15 and such. If he can overtake Bernie in the delegate tracker on South Carolina, I think that's sort of the, amazing situation. Similar to how Bernie had a really good night in Nevada. I don't think that's necessarily the most likely outcome, but I think that's how I see it: good, great, and then excellent.
Yeah, I worry about maybe, and we'll kind of talk about the current state of the polling, but I think his performance relative to the polls are going to determine a lot of the media narrative, just based on the expectations. I know I said this when we were wrapping up our Nevada caucus results, but I think especially the big story coming out of New Hampshire was Amy Klobuchar, and everybody was talking about Klobuchar-mentum, or whatever the portmanteau that we decided upon. However, that sort of collapsed pretty immediately. But the reason why we were talking about it so much was because she outperformed her polls pretty substantially. And I wonder, especially seeing the last few days of the polling in South Carolina, where we are seeing Biden up by double digits, I think that that's pretty much where he has to be to have this commanding lead. Where if he leads Sanders by even high single digits, and yes, it's sort of an arbitrary threshold to say single digits versus double digits. But I think even if it's a high single digit lead, people might say that it's not enough, especially relative to these polls that show a pretty favorable position for Biden.
That's fair. I do think that as people who obsess over these elections, we maybe discount the value of the banner, Joe Biden wins South Carolina a bit. That's why I think, even if he does underperform the polls at this point slightly, I think he positions himself. I think we take for granted sort of Biden as the second place finisher on Super Tuesday. I think him winning South Carolina by more than a couple points positions himself to be that second place finisher on Super Tuesday, and I think we're maybe discounting the value of that a bit.
Is this really a fight between Biden and Sanders at this point, or is it Biden and Bloomberg? Because their polling has sort of gone neck and neck, and I don't know, maybe you want to hit that when we go into the polling section, since we're starting to wrap this up here. But it's interesting, this multi-way fight, and who's actually trying to get whose voters.
Well, off of that, it was interesting to see, even in the debate, the South Carolina debate, how Biden, yes, he went after Sanders a little bit, but he was kind of explicitly going after Tom Steyer, and rightly so, because that's sort of, Tom Steyer in South Carolina has been the one going after, I think, voters who would ordinarily be Joe Biden supporters. And so that was sort of an interesting dynamic to see. And I think you're right. At least I think in the question that you're asking, Drew, I think you're right to point out that it could be this Biden